There's a number most people would never include on a list of important numbers. It shows up on screens, spreadsheets, thermometers, dates, and financial statements. But almost no one stops to think of it as an idea in itself. We skip right past it. We take it for granted. We treat it like an empty space between the other numbers, a gap with no content, a signal of absence. But zero has something no other number has. It exists to represent what doesn't exist yet, and without it, nothing that does exist could be properly arranged. That paradox is at the heart of this first journey. Not zero as a mathematical figure, but zero as a symbol, as a way of thinking, as a way of naming something that, even when it seems empty, holds a real place on the map of meaning. To understand what zero represents symbolically, it helps to start with the simplest question. What happens before something begins? Think about an empty room. Not an abandoned room, but one that hasn't been lived in yet. No furniture, no artwork, no history. But it has something harder to name. It has possibility. That room could become anything. A library, a bedroom, a workshop, a quiet space. The emptiness that defines it isn't a flaw. It's a form of availability. Zero works in a similar way. In a symbolic reading, zero doesn't mean lack or failure. It points to that prior state where no decision has been made, no direction has been chosen, no option has been ruled out. It's the space where something can appear precisely because nothing occupies it yet. This idea has a long history, though it wasn't always obvious to everyone. For centuries, many cultures counted, measured, and calculated without needing a symbol for nothing. If there was nothing to count, nothing was written down. The void didn't need a representation because it wasn't considered a quantity. It was, quite literally, the absence of quantity. But when certain mathematical traditions, particularly in India and later in the Arab world, began to treat zero as a value in its own right, something shifted deeply in the way numerical thinking was organized. It wasn't just a technical advance, it was a conceptual change, the recognition that absence can also have a place, that emptiness can occupy a position, that what is not there can be named, and, once named, can be thought. That transformed arithmetic, but it also left a mark on the way human beings began to imagine origin, beginning, the point from which something departs. In symbolic terms, zero is most often associated with exactly that, the pure point of departure. Not the first step, but the moment just before the first step. The instant when you're already standing at the threshold, but haven't crossed it yet. That fraction of time, or of awareness, that exists right before something begins to take shape. We can find that experience in many everyday situations. In the pause before speaking, when the words haven't come out yet, but are already forming. In the blank page before the first line is written. In the dark screen before a film begins. In the silence before the opening chord of a song. In the breath someone draws before saying something that matters. Those moments have something in common. They're not empty in the sense of useless or lifeless. They're empty in the sense of open, not yet determined, still capable of going in any direction. Within a non-religious numerological reading, zero can be interpreted as the symbol of that state. Not as a sign that something is missing, but as a sign that something can arrive. Not as a low score, but as a starting position. There's an important distinction worth developing here, because not all emptiness feels the same. There's a kind of emptiness that weighs on you, that unsettles you, that produces anxiety. A bank account at zero with bills due. Free time you don't know how to fill. A conversation that ended without resolution. A project abandoned halfway through. Those zeros create tension because they're tied to an expectation that wasn't met, to something that should be there and isn't. But there's another kind of emptiness, quite different from that one. The rest between two phases. The pause after finishing something and before starting the next thing. The uncertainty that doesn't paralyze, but opens up. The moment when you don't yet know exactly what comes next, but you can feel that what just closed is no longer present, and what's coming hasn't taken shape yet. That kind of emptiness can be uncomfortable, but it can also be fertile. Zero, as a symbol, doesn't belong exclusively to either one. What makes it interesting to think about symbolically is that it holds that ambiguity honestly. It isn't good or bad. It's the name we give to the space where something can still become. That ambiguity also shows up in the experience of starting over. Going back to zero is a phrase people use fairly often, and it tends to carry negative weight. Returning to the starting point, losing what you'd built, having to begin again. There are situations where that genuinely hurts, and there's no point in minimizing that. But there's something else in that image worth paying attention to. Going back to zero can also mean returning to a state of openness, recovering the ability to choose differently, releasing what no longer served in order to make room for something that hasn't arrived yet. In that sense, zero doesn't only mark the end of something, it also marks the threshold of what can follow. Not everyone moves through that experience the same way, and the difference often has less to do with the objective situation than with how that empty space is interpreted, whether it's read as a permanent loss or as a necessary pause, whether it's inhabited with resistance or with something closer to readiness. In many non-religious symbolic traditions, zero is connected to that capacity for pause. Not passive stillness, but active stillness. The kind of silence that isn't the absence of thought, but a full presence before thought finds its direction. Consider something more concrete. A meeting that ends and leaves a silence in the room before anyone speaks. A runner who crosses the finish line and has one brief instant before the result has a name in their mind. A person who has just made a difficult decision and hasn't yet fully processed what they chose. In those moments, there is something that closely resembles what zero tries to name. The space between what was and what will be. Zero, understood this way, isn't just a number. It's a way of naming thresholds. The moments of transition that are real but hard to describe because they're neither one thing nor the other yet. They're exactly that interval where the future hasn't taken form, but the past no longer holds. One way to read zero symbolically is as the number that protects that interval. That gives a name to the pause. That acknowledges that between an ending and a beginning, there is something that isn't nothing, but can't be reduced to pure absence either. It's a space that exists, that has its own texture, its own timing, its own function. That function can seem minor if what you're looking for in numbers is concrete answers, instructions, or signs. But if you approach numbers as maps of meaning, as tools for thinking through experience, then zero turns out to be one of the richest, because it speaks to something everyone knows but few people have words for. The experience of being in between, of having finished something and not yet having started what comes next, of feeling that the ground beneath you is no longer the old one, but the new one isn't quite solid yet, of living inside a transition without certainty and without rushing. Zero doesn't resolve that experience. It doesn't explain it or predict it, but it names it. And naming something, even just to acknowledge that it exists, is already a way of relating to it differently. That's ultimately what any well-used symbol does. It doesn't replace the experience. It doesn't simplify it. It puts it in perspective. It offers a frame that allows you to think about it more clearly, without forcing it into rigid categories of good or bad. progress or setback, full or empty. 0 in that reading isn't nothingness. It's the name of the space where nothing exists yet, but where everything still can. It's the place before the first mark is made, the silence before the first note, the instant before the first step. And there's something in that which isn't small, because without that space, without that interval, without that 0 holding the possibility open, none of the numbers that follow would have anywhere to start from.